the reality of it is we know we cannot make the type of progress we need to make on this unless we have both parties at the table.
That was Congressman John Curtis, a Republican representing the state of Utah. This past June, he introduced the Conservative Climate Caucus, bringing more than 60 Republican members of Congress together to identify conservative solutions to reduce emissions and grow economic prosperity. This is Energy Solutions, a podcast from the Electric Power Supply Association, where we unpack the stories and trends behind America's changing electric grid. I'm your host, Todd Snitchler, EPSA's president and CEO. Representative Curtis is our guest on this episode. As EPSA works to carve out solutions that build our competitive energy future while addressing environmental and economic goals, we wanted to hear his thoughts on how conservatives are tackling climate policy and what common ground might be found on Capitol Hill. Beyond bringing U.S. Republicans and Democrats together, we also cover how global leaders are talking about these issues with a download from his visit to Glasgow for COP26. Representative Curtis, thanks so much for joining us tonight. We're recording in the evening after, I'm sure, a long day of legislating, and it's always interesting for folks to get to know our guests a little bit, and I'm not sure everyone knows you as well as your bio has let us get to know you. So we know you have a lot of interest beyond politics, from family to water skiing and Mandarin Chinese as well. But I also hear, and I have seen, at least one part of your collection of stately socks. And so the operative question for today is, what's the order of the day for your sock choice today?
Well, I'm not quite sure how to best show this to you, so I'll just do my best. This is like, oh, there's the socks there. They're polka dot. How's that?
Polka dots work. So I think that's what I was wearing when we met. So it's great minds think alike. So as we get started with more of the substantive part of our interview, I want to cover a number of things, but you cover a lot of issues on the Hill. And of course, we want to focus on energy and climate related issues. And I'd like to chat with you in more detail about your activity with the Conservative Climate Caucus. But before we do that, can you sum up what some of your key issues are and positions on climate and energy? Because I think they're vitally important for people to know where you're coming from.
Yeah, I think as a background, it's helpful to know that before I came to Congress, I was a mayor of a municipal power city. Mm-hmm. And so what that means is I ran a utility. 10 years ago, 12 years ago, when I first came to that role, we were about 80% reliant on coal for that. We made some very slow transitions. The reason they were slow is we were in long-term contracts, 20, 30-year contracts with coal power plants. But we made a number of transitions. Kind of interestingly, one of them was to natural gas. And I smile because at the time we did that, we bought a natural gas plant here in Utah. An activist actually brought me flowers to council meeting because natural gas burns about half of the greenhouse gas emissions. Well, in today's world, natural gas is now the enemy, and I'm sure they wouldn't have brought me flowers for that. But it shows a little bit, my background in this. I think it's also important for people to know that I represent some coal country as part of my district. As a matter of fact, one of my counties is actually called Carbon County, and the adjoining county, Emery County, has a coal-fired power plant in their district. It's the major employer. And I've seen firsthand the devastation that's come about out of the villainization of coal and fossil fuels. I've seen high unemployment and the crime and drug use and things that comes along with that, and how we've done a terrible job of transitioning these communities. And I see the look in their eyes when we villainize fossil fuels, and they feel like the people that have been part of that. So I think that's an important part of my background as we have these discussions, is that I do come from that background and have a sense of that side of the story as well.
That's right. It's a background not a lot of legislators come with, and I think that makes you uniquely qualified to talk about some of these things. So you've mentioned a couple of things, which I'm sure you'll want to dig into a little more, but what do you see as their critical needs or the critical questions that we're facing today? And then what's your approach to trying to address the challenges that are before us?
Well, I think to kind of sum it up, we need to reduce our worldwide greenhouse gas emissions.
Sure.
I regret that too often the conversation has nothing to do with that. And We're talking about, for instance, closing down a pipeline in the United States so that we ship in less oil from our neighbors in Canada. But then the reality of it is, by closing that down, we then ask Russia and OPEC to produce more oil under dirtier conditions.
Mm-hmm.
And so to kind of crystallize, I think where I'm going with this is, I want to bring sanity to the debate, and kind of call out things that are maybe have another agenda besides reducing worldwide greenhouse gas emissions. Because I'm telling you, I'm all in to reduce worldwide greenhouse gas emissions, but I'm not all in for some of the ways they're being proposed to do that.
Fair enough. So obviously, one of the things that we found of particular interest, and we're hoping that you'll chat with us about, is your work informing and leading the Conservative Climate Caucus, which I think for some folks, they're probably scratching their head at the moment. And so we thought it'd be a useful opportunity for you to share a little bit about that, because I think it's important for folks to hear that there is, in fact, engagement on both sides of the aisle. How does that group look at some of these same issues we were talking about with regard to critical needs and questions?
Let me go back a little bit to that background I came from and say, how does a guy like that end up leading the Conservative Climate Caucus?
Right. Fair question.
Yeah, the answer to that is I came to Congress and could see the gap between conservatives who care deeply about this earth
Mm-hmm.
and the way that we were perceived. And that bothered me. And so I started a 4-year pursuit of trying to understand this issue and trying to understand it through a conservative's eyes.
Mm-hmm.
And what I found out was really very enlightening, that you don't have to give up your conservative credentials to care deeply and to make substantial changes in reducing worldwide greenhouse gas emissions. And yet, conservatives and Republicans have stayed on the sidelines in this debate and allowed ourselves to be branded as not caring and denying the science. And I just think that's a shame. We do care. We care deeply. And we're thoughtful on the science. We want to have thoughtful discussions on the science. And yet, as you have alluded to, that's a surprise and a shock to most people.
Sure.
So we first of all, individually, I spent a substantial amount of time trying to understand these issues and what really moves the needle and what doesn't. But then I felt like, we've got to start talking about this as Republicans. And a little known secret is that last February, I invited Republican lawmakers to Utah to talk about the climate.
Mm-hmm.
Well, why is it a little known secret? Because some of those that came said, we won't come if the press finds out about it. They were that uncomfortable with talking about climate. But as it turns out, my staff said, you'll have 5 or 6 people come out. We had 24 members of Congress, Republican members, come to Utah to talk about climate last February. 6 of those were ranking members over the committees of jurisdiction. It was a huge success. And we knew from that moment, and from the conversations that we had with these 24, that like me, they were eager to get away from the branding that we don't care and change the whole dialogue. And instead of telling everybody what we don't like, let's start telling people what we like. We've become expert in saying what we don't like. Everybody knows we don't like the Green New Deal. They don't know what we like.
Yeah.
And so from that trip, we said, look, the next step is to bring all of our members in. And so we formed this caucus, spent a tremendous amount of time on the name. Why is the name important? It's because there are other caucuses from Republicans that take care of environmental stewardship, but because they don't use the word climate, they're not taken seriously.
Understood.
We knew we had to use the word climate, but we wanted the word conservative in there to point out that this is a different approach than our Democratic colleagues. Amazing success. Within a couple of weeks, 74 members of the House of Representatives joined. That's a third of all Republicans in the House of Representatives joined this caucus. Okay, hold your breath. The first tenet is the climate's changing and Matt's had some influence on it.
Right.
So that's, first of all, break that stereotype right up front. It's like, you know what, we're on board. We're here. Now, our answers may be different than yours, but we're here. We want a seat at the table. We want to be part of the solution to this. And that's what led us to forming the caucus. The primary goal of the caucus is to get Republicans comfortable talking about climate, to get on their feet.
Yep.
Let's face it, if you ask a Republican in a town hall meeting if the climate's changing, if man's influencing it, they're going to look at their shoes and they're going to do everything but answer the question.
Sure.
And it's not because they don't want to answer the question, but they feel like they're stepping into a trap. The question feels like a trap. What I want Republicans to do is say, of course it's changing. Of course man's had some influence on it. Let me tell you what I'm doing about it. Bang, 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 bang. This is what I'm doing about it. So
Sure.
that's how we'll know the caucus is successful is if we get a vast number of my colleagues turning that corner, talking about it, hitting it head on, and then listing the things they're doing about it.
The number of initial participants, I think we both my eyebrows went up as yours did. It's a bit of a surprise. Did you have to actively go about getting support, or did you tell the caucus this is what we're doing, and you had people lining up outside your door? How's that work?
This is what's amazing. We targeted, maybe a dozen members who were influential, and everybody else called us. And it's just been really fun to be part of this, to see how many members. The next phase is actually to go a little bit more aggressively and recruit members. I think we can get far more than a third, but we're kind of getting our feet underneath this and getting caught up with making sure it's a good experience for those third before we expand it to much larger.
That makes a lot of sense. So as we kind of understand your perspective and where you're coming from, what is it that folks should know about what's important to conservatives, if we want to label it as that, when it comes to climate and energy? Because I think, certainly I'll disclose from EPSA's perspective, we view energy as a nonpartisan issue. At the end of the day, it should be a nonpartisan issue. Reliability, affordability, innovation, and emissions reductions are all things that everybody should be able to believe in, whether you're on the left side of the aisle or the right side of the aisle. But you're coming at it from certainly within the caucus and trying to address that. So what should people know about where conservatives come down on climate and energy?
Message number one is we do care, right? We've not necessarily done a good job of branding ourselves. We do care, and we care deeply. Message number two, we don't have to kill the US economy. We don't have to sacrifice jobs to dramatically impact worldwide greenhouse gas emissions and turn the corner on this climate issue. And that our ideas actually lead to greater US prosperity and greater US employment and jobs. And we don't put us at a disadvantage with China. That's what I think a really exciting part of this discussion, because so many people have assumed, wow, we have to sacrifice so much in jobs and economy and prosperity. I don't think we do.
Right. And I think that's an important consideration, because that is one of the things, we've done some polling and the public is concerned about those issues. Everyone wants the lower emissions. They want affordability. They really, really want reliability, but they also don't want to see their neighbors lose jobs. And I don't think that's an unreasonable position. So
nor do they want to see their utility bills quadrupled.
That's for sure. As a former regulator, I can tell you, consumers always paid what they paid last month. They never think about what they paid a couple of years ago, as you well know, and a municipal is even different than a regulated utility. So it's definitely where people's pocketbooks are impacted. You get phone calls, and on that, I think everyone can agree. So, how do you view your solution set, or the ideas that are being considered by the Conservative Climate Caucus? How are they different than some of your colleagues, either fully on the other side of the aisle, or maybe some folks who have a different perspective? Is there a set of policies that you're kind of coalescing around, or that you're working through?
Yeah. And let me say off the top, as I share these with you, they don't represent the caucus. They represent. Does that really make sense? And so what I think is super exciting is the things that we're promoting, I think actually complement my Democratic colleagues' approach. And let me tell you what I mean by that. Right now, I don't care who you are. When you stand up and say, we're going to be carbon neutral by 2050, whether you're a business or a city, everybody's got an asterisk by that. The asterisk is, I don't know how we're going to do it. Right. Or we don't have the current technology. I think this is exciting about what Republicans are putting forward is we fill that gap. We know the answer to that. We know how to get there. Now, can it be by 2050? That's a good question. But we think we can get our ideas that we're actually putting forward, I think, fit nicely with what's out there, and we close that gap. And we also make it so that we don't have to go 100% wind and solar to get to that 2050, right? I think we have the answers that fill in nicely with that.
And I think that's important, because, the common criticism that many will say is, well, these are just platitudes. This is an effort to play politics with an important issue. As we look at, how would you respond, I guess, is the way to answer that. How would you respond to folks that say, well, this is just, Representative Curtis is trying to get out in front of an issue that he knows is a bad one for Republicans, and this is lip service? How do you respond to critics that would make those claims?
Yeah, the reality of it is they can do that on any issue. It could be immigration, right? As soon as somebody steps up to the table and says, let's solve this. And you could do that on any issue, right? And what I've been really pleased with is a number of my Democratic colleagues who have embraced what we're doing, have said, thank you, this is awesome, we want to work with you. I actually think the litmus test is those who say that are serious about fixing the problem.
Right.
Those who kind of say, you're not serious, they're not serious, right? If they were serious, they would welcome us at the table.
Sure.
They would pull out a chair at the climate table and say, have a seat. The reality of it is we know we cannot make the type of progress we need to make on this unless we have both parties at the table.
Right. And we'd agree with that wholeheartedly. And as you know better than I do, although as a watcher from the outside, I think we would probably agree that in Washington, it's been more and more difficult to find agreement on these very difficult issues. So is there a way to get consensus, to get real action?
Yeah. And let me point out, this is, I think, kind of the overlooked fact. We have worked substantially. Let me go back to the Energy Act of 2020.
Sure.
Major piece of legislation. It reduces hydrofluorocarbons by 85%. I'm told if we did that worldwide, that's a 0.5 degree Celsius, right? Now, I'm not a scientist, but that's a big deal, right? That was a Republican, Democrat, co-led, co-enthusiastic piece of legislation. Tens of billions of dollars in there for research and things like that. 45Q, right? I mean, there have been substantial legislative victories. One of the things that we need to do is stop and celebrate and point out, wait, we do work together. We are doing things. Now, could we do more? Yes. Should we do more? Absolutely. Yes, we've got to do more. Totally agree with that. But I do think it's important to point out, you know what? We've actually made some pretty good progress.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, because those victories do seem to fly under the radar because they don't make for great headlines, where headlines, conflict makes for good headlines.
Exactly.
Cooperation does not. So I'm glad you mentioned those. Speaking of cooperation, President Biden has said that robust competition and a fair marketplace should be a foundation for the economy. And of course, at EPSA, we couldn't agree more with that statement. How do you think market-driven competitive policies will advance climate and energy goals? Because I assume that's foursquare within a conservative mindset would be a market-driven outcome. So how do you see that working, or how do you envision that playing out?
I couldn't agree more. Now, I could question whether or not President Biden's really shown us that, but let me just say, absolutely. I had a fascinating meeting this morning with a local company here in my district who is working on a plan that will conserve agricultural water by 98%. You know why they're doing it? To make money, right?
Yep.
And you look throughout the marketplace, and there are these fascinating entrepreneurs. Some we can point to that have been very, very successful. I'm thinking of Bill Gates and others who've been very, very successful and willing to plow large amounts of money back into that. Look at Tesla, right? And look at how he has radically changed the EV market because he was willing to pour private capital back into this because ultimately he wanted to make money, and look at the money he's made, right? So I do believe that the marketplace in the United States is hot, is ready, is innovative. Now, to be fair, the government did offer EV incentives, right, which helped a lot.
Sure.
And so I do think there's a role for government to poke and prod along the way. And I do think when government gets involved, we should be more agnostic about too often government tries to pick winners and losers. I would prefer that all our incentives said, look, if you figure out how to reduce carbon, you get the incentive. We don't care how, right? And I'm not, we may not even yet understand the technology that will lead us to a carbon neutral future. So let's not rule out anything. But I'm just a huge fan of the private market. I think at its heart, it will get us there much quicker than the government.
And typically at a lower cost. At least that's been our experience, and the analysis that's been done will back that up. So the other 800-pound gorilla that folks don't always want to talk about is carbon pricing. And so I'm curious if you or if the Climate Caucus has taken a position. Do you see a path forward, or is that a non-starter, or is that something that's under consideration but no decisions have been made?
It's interesting because I think, if truth be told, Democrats hate it worse than Republicans.
Okay, that's the first time I've heard that.
Well, you ask them. Like, for instance, it was a month or so ago that one of the ideas for the Build Back Better was to pay for it with the carbon tax.
Yeah.
They had their shot, right? If that's what they wanted to do, that would have been their tax of choice. They don't like it either.
Yeah.
And I have my suspicions why they don't like it. I think it basically gives a life to fossil fuels, which is why they don't like it. I'm not sure of that, but that's my understanding. So you'll find some on the right, you'll find some on the left who like this idea. I have serious reservations about it, and my reservations have to do with it's a tax. When you talk about it in terms of a dividend, do we really trust the U.S. government to take all that revenue and give it back? I don't. Do we trust China? How do we deal with the bad actors around the world with the carbon tax? Nobody's shown me a formula that doesn't put the United States at a disadvantage and advantage China, and that's a serious flaw to me. It's also, we've got to remember carbon. One of the greenhouse gas emissions, it's not going to solve the whole problem. And I think too many people look at it like, oh, if you would just do this one thing, we would fix it. And I just don't think that's true.
Fair enough. So for those of us that are in the industry, and our members, as you know, are competitive power generators who own all types of resources, from coal to nuclear to natural gas to battery storage to renewables, you name it, we own it. What can we be doing to help policymakers either understand the issue or effectuate better policies, or help to educate some of your colleagues in a way that they can understand how our perspective may be different from our utility or public power or our rural co-op cousins, but in the end, we're all still striving for the same thing, which is reliability and affordability. What can we do from your seat to help make your job easier?
Too many lawmakers don't understand your business. And our constituents don't understand your business. So it's all too easy to, of the things that you just listed, it's all too easy to stand up and say, no more fossil fuels. Get rid of them. Oh, really? Let me tell you a quick story, if you don't mind. I was at COP26, and I had an opportunity to have dinner with the president of Scottish Power. And he said to me, we're 100% renewable. Wow, you're 100%. Tell me about that. How are you 100% renewable? We have so much wind. We have way more wind than we need. Okay, what happens? This is like the guy who used to own a municipal power. What happens when the wind stops blowing? Oh, he says, well, we just import power from overseas that comes from natural gas. And 2 minutes later, he restated his claim that he was 100% renewable.
Right.
And so we've got this education gap, right? Like, here is the reality. Renewables will play a substantial role in getting to a carbon-free future, but not unless we figure out storage. Right? So we've got to get going on storage. And so we've got to start talking about storage. The better we are with storage, the more renewables will influence this. I think undiscovered, what I call newly developed technologies, will play a major role in this. So the next generation nuclear, hydrogen, perhaps fusion at some point, right? This whole list of things that we need to be innovating, but people don't understand those, right? So how do we help people really understand that and be willing to make the investment in those things? And then the third component to this, I call this my three-legged stool, is fossil fuels. And the reality of it is, people don't really believe me when I say this, but you'll understand this. We've reduced more carbon, more greenhouse gas emissions in the United States than the next 12 greenhouse gas emitting countries combined. How did we do it? With a fossil fuel, natural gas, replacing coal. And now, what is the problem? That's fine for bridge fuel, but what's the problem long-term with fossil fuels? It's got to be solved with carbon sequestration, right? So there is a role for fossil fuels, but you can put that asterisk by it of we've got to figure out sequestration. And there's also a role in the interim. India right now has 800 million people without electricity. They're burning dung and wood, right? They're going to turn to coal. We don't want them on coal. China's opening a coal plant per day. We don't want that. I'd much rather have them burning US natural gas. And so I think, to answer your question, is helping lawmakers, helping people around the world understand your business, right? And understand what happens if we only have wind and solar at night, right? You okay with blackouts? You okay with quadrupling of prices? No, there's no call a mayor gets quicker than I don't have power.
That's right.
Or wait a minute, my bill doubled.
That's right.
And I think we're kind of in this together. And like we've got to. People have to understand reliability. We have to understand, all these moving parts. I think that's my biggest challenge is getting people informed on that so we can make good policy decisions.
So it's a heavy educational lift is what I'm taking from that.
Yes.
Fair enough. You mentioned your trip to COP, and of course, I was very interested to kind of get your feedback. I haven't talked with you since you came back, but I know you went with several Republican colleagues, and you were involved in some meetings. And so I wouldn't ask you to disclose anything from those. But what was your message while you were there, and how were you received by the other international attendees and guests?
Well, it won't surprise you. We tended to affiliate with the international guests that saw things like we saw things.
Sure.
So, for instance, I had a couple of breakfasts with conservative lawmakers from the UK, from Australia, and from Canada. Wow, really powerful in combining our voices and saying, look, they're right where we are as far as conservatives saying, yeah, we've got to come up with answers. Really had some really fruitful conversations with them. Interesting conversations with countries like Taiwan. I used to live in Taiwan. You mentioned I speak Mandarin. So think about this. You're a country that is, I think it's about 30 million people. I forget exactly how many. And you're an eighth the size of Utah.
Yeah.
You don't have a spot for solar farms. You don't have, right? I mean, you've got to come up with different answers. Australia is really interesting. They have outlawed nuclear. And so it was really interesting to see the different parameters of people out there. I mentioned Scotland that's doing so much with wind. Really interesting to see that geographically, we all have very, very different challenges in how we tackle this.
Yeah, it's further proof that there is no one size fits all, even in the United States, although there are some who would argue that we can do it that way. We wouldn't agree with that statement. We think that every region's a little different, and there are certain places where one resource is very effective and not at all in another part of the country. So coming out of COP26, what do you see? Was any progress made? Do you feel like it was a good investment? Was it educational for the caucus members who went, or was this a throw your hands up and, well, that was a trip I wish I hadn't made experience?
On the perspective of educational, it was a home run, grand slam. I mean, what we learned, what we saw, what we were able to participate in was fantastic. And I came away a better legislator because of my experience over there. We all have questions about just how valid the commitments are over there, right, and things like that. And I have that as well. I think what we need to do as Republicans is this time we were just kind of getting our feet underneath us going over there. Next time, I'd like to go over with a specific agenda of ourselves that we're promoting, right, and another voice to some of the things that are out there. Internationally, unless we get our arms around China and Russia and India, it's almost, I don't want to say what we're doing is fruitless, but we can't reach our climate goals by ourselves. We just can't, right? And I actually believe that the role for the United States here is to develop the low-cost alternative. China will adopt it the day it's a low-cost alternative. We already have that, by the way, which is natural gas. And I think this is why it's a mistake to shut down exporting natural gas. Is I get it. You don't want to be there long term. Fine, we can have that conversation. But short term, it's a cheaper alternative to coal in China. We could cut their emissions more than the entire Green New Deal simply by shipping U.S. natural gas over there. Those are the conversations we're not having at COP.
Sure, understood. So I guess as we look at this, I'm going to ask you the $64,000 question, which I seem to ask every guest. It seems I must like that reference. I keep using it. But will Congress be able to do what it aims to do and pass legislation that really can reduce emissions and deliver reliable, affordable energy? I know that's a goal, but do you think Congress can get there and do it? It feels like there's a reluctance to take on these difficult issues because it's easier to bicker than it is to work together. And so I'm curious if you're optimistic or if you're pessimistic or if you're somewhere in between.
I'm an optimistic guy. Now, that being said, we're on the wrong track.
Sure.
We're going to spend trillions of dollars and we're not aiming for a target. We're shooting a shotgun out there. We're putting charging stations on freeways. We don't have the grid to support those charging stations. And if you have the grid, you don't have the power. And so I feel like, and this is, I think, where our voices are so important in this conversation, is I think we're bringing a little bit of sanity to this conversation to say, no. It's worldwide greenhouse gas emissions, stupid, right? That's it's like the economy, stupid, right? It's no. It's worldwide greenhouse gas emissions. or none of this matters, right? Sure, we need to take care of our own house. Don't disagree with that, but we've got to stay focused on that. And I had, as a really good example, Toyota was in my office 2 weeks ago. He told me that plug-in hybrids are better for the environment than EVs. Why? Because when you build an EV, you put so many critical minerals and carbon into building that battery that you would be better off with a smaller battery and a little bit of petrol that is better for the environment. Those are the questions we're not asking, right? We're kind of head over heels in what feels good. We need to be far more thoughtful. What are the life cycle greenhouse gas emissions of an EV? I don't know anybody that owns one that can tell me that. So maybe a plug-in, maybe that's what we should be incentivizing, is plug-in hybrids and not EVs. But we're not doing that. You could say we're not following the science.
Sure. Well, as we wind down, and you've been very generous with your time, so we certainly appreciate that. What are you most hopeful or excited about when it comes to both addressing climate change and putting America on the right track in the 21st century when it comes to energy solutions?
I'm absolutely positively convinced that the American mind, the American innovation can take us to where we need to go and deal with the impacts of a changing climate. That's a reality that we're going to have to deal with. And all we need to do is unleash that power and let it go. And I'm absolutely convinced that we can reach all of our goals.
Great. I love the optimism. It's a kind of a refreshing voice, and we're, of course, happy to hear it. Is there anything else that you'd want our listeners to know about either the Climate Caucus or the work that you're doing or how you're thinking about some of these challenges? The floor is yours.
Wow, you don't want to give a microphone to a politician. You've done a really thoughtful job with these questions. I would summarize it this way. Republicans do care deeply. We want to be at the climate table, and we think our ideas are very, very important to reaching our goals.
Congressman Curtis, we thank you very much for taking time to visit with us. This is an important conversation and certainly, I think, a new voice to add to the chorus. And I hope that this will drive some deeper conversations with folks both inside the caucus and across the aisle as we work collectively to educate, as you've informed us we need to do, to try and arrive at good energy policy. So thanks very much for joining us.
It's been a pleasure. Hope we get to do it again.
Appreciate it. EPSA has made and continues to make policy recommendations to decision makers at every level. You can find more information about those recommendations and competitive power markets on our website at www.epsa.org. I also invite you to check out Energy Solutions Episode 6, Climate Policy Conservatives Can Love, where I talk with Alex Flint, head of the Alliance for Market Solutions, about his efforts to find and share market-based solutions that can accelerate decarbonization without sending America over the fiscal cliff. Thanks for listening to Energy Solutions. If you like this episode, please share it on social media or with your coworkers, friends, and family. You can also connect with us on Twitter at EPSA News and on LinkedIn. And subscribe, follow, leave a rating or comment on Spotify, Pandora, Google, or wherever you listen to podcasts. We're also happy to answer your questions or take ideas for new episodes. Send them to press@epsa.org.
Energy Solutions is brought to you by the Electric Power Supply Association. EPSA represents America's competitive power suppliers, which bring about 150,000 megawatts of power generation resources to customers throughout the United States. Discover the power of competition at www.epsa.org.